Well, it feels like a lot of water has gone under the bridge, so to speak, since the last time I stood up here in front of you doing this, even though it's been just a couple of weeks. First, because I got COVID and spent about 3 days sleeping and a few more days recovering. And yeah, it's quite a thing to just have a week just sort of poof, disappear from your life. In my case, a week that I had very thoroughly programmed with all kinds of meetings and writing projects, the wedding last Saturday that I was supposed to officiate at and preach. And it was a reminder to me, a valuable reminder in a way, of how much is beyond my control, how much of the work of the church is not up to me, how much the ministry of the gospel is not my particular vocation, but ours together. And so I relied on others to keep it going as I was lying there feeling miserable with my head splitting and my body aching and helpless. So Mary Piper preached and officiated at the wedding on Saturday, gave a homily that I wrote for her to give, and dusted off a sermon from her files, and showed up on Sunday morning here and presided and preached. And then I came back to work, testing negative and feeling basically symptom-free, and on Tuesday morning I got a call from a woman named Kelly who identified herself as the sister-in-law of Emily Cox, who had suffered a brain aneurysm and was dying in the hospital. A grievous blow to our community. We've lost several beloved people here over the 6 months or so that I've been your rector. But, you know, most of them were folks in their 90s, and they left a big hole here, each of them, and yet, you know, it kind of made sense. But Emily, a woman not yet 50, someone so full of life, and warmth, vitality, a young, relatively speaking, leader in our congregation, just taken like that. Reminder of how much is not in our control. How much of what is going on here is beyond our capacity to understand. Now, our scriptures today, in particular, our reading from Numbers and our gospel lesson, are kind of about this, about how what God is doing with us is beyond our control. It's so much bigger than we understand. So when Moses is, feeling the burden of responsibility of carrying this people, through the desert, trying to keep them moving forward toward the promised land, and they're complaining and grumbling, can't we just go back to Egypt? Forgetting about the slavery part. Just remembering the fish, and the garlic, and the melons, and the cucumbers. And then in our gospel, John comes to Jesus and says, we came upon this guy casting out demons in your name. But he's not following us. He's not part of our team. He's kind of a freelancer out there doing your work in your name. So we tried to stop him. Tried to get him under our control. And Jesus says, don't do that. Don't do that. My team is a whole lot bigger than you realize. What's going on here is beyond our control. It's so much bigger than we understand. And that's true of the things that are painful, the sudden death of a dear friend, illness we weren't planning on. But it's also true in a positive sense. God is working in Christ, in the world, in ways that we do not control, ways that we may not even understand. And when we stumble over each other, because that's really what is at stake here in this gospel lesson, which warns us in such kind of frightening and extreme terms of the peril that we are potentially in. Peril so great that it would be better to cut off an arm or a leg or pull out an eye than to fall into the trap. But what's really at stake, what leads to hell, is when we try to limit our understanding of who Christ is and what his work in the world looks like to something that we can control, something that we understand, define in terms that suit us who's on the team and who is not. This stumbling that we are so prone to, stumbling over each other, is also stumbling over Christ. Jesus in the New Testament is the big stumbling block. Paul, writing to the Corinthians, says, I preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews. And you remember what it is to the Gentiles, an embarrassment, a bad joke, something like that. Anyway, we must remain open to the work that Christ is doing in each other, not stumbling over it because it doesn't look like how we want it to look. Have salt in yourselves, says Jesus. That salt without which you're just kind of bland and tasteless. Really be yourself. But give other people the freedom to do it too. Be at peace with one another. Now that sounds good. We like peace. But we are called to take a stand. And that's the really tricky thing about being a Christian. We really want to be at peace with everyone. We really want to honor the image of God in everyone. We must do that, even as we honor it in ourselves. And yet, we have to pick a side. We have to be on the side of Christ. Being at peace with one another doesn't mean that you just avoid at all costs anything that could possibly be controversial. Jesus did not do that. So for the last 4 weeks, we've been observing this ecumenical season of creation. And I invited us to do this not just because, this is something that I care about, although it is, but because this is something that, in spite of all of our visions as Christians, in spite of all of the ways that we stumble over each other, and have been doing so for centuries, there has been an awakening in global Christianity of our responsibility as human beings to do, shall we say, a better job as a species. Because we are just one species. We are placed here on a finite earth, for which we have been given responsibility and extraordinary power, extraordinary capacities to alter the world to meet our own needs. That is what it means to be human in one sense. We're born, kind of naked. We're these sort of helpless creatures. It takes us a long time to mature. We have to kind of invent a habitable world for ourselves through our cleverness and our opposable thumbs and all these other things that we've been given. We are at the threshold of an evolutionary leap. Somehow, we need to learn how to live in this human manner where we create a habitable world out of, what God has created for us. But in a manner that doesn't destroy everything else. It doesn't squander what God has created. Doesn't pollute it. Doesn't burn it all up. So that the other creatures and our own descendants even are left with a hollowed out, burned out, polluted waste. So Christians all over the world have been waking up to this responsibility and taking a stand for it in whatever way we can. And that can be controversial. It can stir the pot a little bit, but we have to do something. It's not enough to just say, peace, 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 because there isn't peace. This is not a world at peace. And we are not at peace with our fellow creatures, with our ecosystems, with our aquifers, with our farmlands, and forests, and ice caps, and oceans. We're not at peace. So, this year for the season of creation, the ecumenical bodies representing the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion and the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church and the World Council of Churches and all these other groups have gotten together and said, okay, so we're going to observe the season of creation again this year, and we need to take some action. It's not enough simply to say, beautiful words about the flowers and the birds and the trees, and, you need to take a stand. So at the coffee hour today, I'll have my laptop, and if you want to come over, you can talk to me, and I can show you how to sign a letter a faith letter to the global community saying we need a binding international legal instrument, a treaty, to phase out fossil fuels. Because that's what we need to do. And we have these high-level summits, these conference of party meetings have been happening around the world for decades now, at which the single largest delegation does not come from any country, but is made up of lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry. And to this date, not a single declaration coming out of any of these COP meetings has used the words fossil fuels. It talks about, reducing emissions and meeting targets and achieving net zero and fossil fuels, people. And so just like global civil society, not governments, organized to pass a global treaty banning landmines, just like global civil society, not governments, organized to push for a global treaty banning chlorofluorocarbons that were decimating the ozone layer. Remember that? Now we need a global movement from the grassroots to get an international legally binding treaty to ban fossil fuels, to phase them out, to stop building more fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines and drilling wells, and all this stuff just keeps happening even as the governments of the world and the fossil fuel companies keep paying lip service to the need to do something maybe someday vaguely about climate change. So anyway, it's just an idea. The treaty's not been written. That's work we're going to have to do together as we move forward. But if you want to sign the letter, take some little bit of action with me about this. I'll see you at coffee hour. And the point is, I guess, as it relates to our gospel lesson today, is that Christ keeps calling us to find him in new ways. Keeps calling us to see him at work in places and among people that we can't control and didn't expect and may not even understand. Keeps calling us to rise to the occasion and stop stumbling over each other, but to find a kind of peace that we have earned, that we've earned by taking a stand for peace, by summoning each other to make peace real, by extending ourselves to create peace where there isn't any, to have salt in ourselves, look for it somewhere else. Know that we are tasty, that we have a particular flavor that, yes, we have been given by God. But everybody else does too. They're out there doing God's work, following Christ, bringing him to life, to address the needs of a world in great distress. Just because we don't control them, just because they don't look like they're on our team, doesn't mean that they're not. That our team actually includes everyone. And not only every human being, but every creature on earth, and the stars, and the galaxies, and the eons of time, and the people who will come after us, generation after generation after generation. That is God's team. If we don't stumble over each other, we have salt in ourselves and peace with one another. That team will